Once upon a time, a young fellow named Nick bought a beautiful house near the city and moved there. The house was small, cozy, and neat. It consisted of only 2 rooms and a hall. Plus, in the yard, there was an old, even older shed. Nick liked the house because it reminded him of a birdhouse, and he always dreamed of having one when he was little. But the main thing that attracted Nick to this particular property was the big plot of land, because it was just an enormous size compared to the house, and most importantly, it was vacant. Moreover, the trees around the house were planted in a checkerboard pattern by someone's hand, and the garden, although neglected, promised to please the eye soon enough. Well, Nick liked the place, so he immediately took the keys to the house and moved in. But when he moved in, he noticed that in the middle of the courtyard, right in the middle, a well grew out of the ground. Gray, stony masonry peeked out of the ground, overgrown with stunted May grass on the sides. The yard itself stood on a vacant lot, with cracked earth in places where the grass had once turned yellow and withered from the prevailing drought. Nick sighed, realizing that he'd have to spend a lot of money on the maintenance of such a large area. The next day, he called the local gardener, who also worked as an arborist, and ordered him to trim the overgrown yellow bushes that stood around the house. Those shrubs were originally planted in a row by the owner's hand once. They were nice, and they must have looked amazing when they were planted. Now, however, after that very drought, they looked withered and devoid of life. The gardener cut them off and told Nick that if he didn't take care of watering them, then they would not grow at all. The air was warm that day. It smelled like May flowers, and the wind was carrying the sounds of a nearby city. Nick went over to the well and looked in. He could see nothing but gray, stony masonry. The dusty air rushed upward. Nick braced his hands against the gray masonry of its edges. His palms felt the pricking surface of the stones. The dust and pebbles crumbled and sank to the bottom with a rustle. Nick wasn't sure if there was water there. At least last year, he didn't try to put a bucket in there anymore. He shouted. The depths of the stone well immediately responded to him with a dull, distant echo. We should check it out, Nick thought idly. Is this really the case, or should we dig a new well? But this thought immediately upset Nick, as he associated it with considerable expenses and the problem of ordering workers who would drink and shout drunken songs under his windows. No, he hastened to remove this prospect from his mind and decided to himself, no, this is my problem, and I'll deal with it, so be it one of these days. And so it went on for another month. Nick lived in a new house, enjoying the peace and quiet, and coming up with various ways to improve the landscape design. However, he kept saying to himself, one of these days, I'll dig up the well. And one evening, Nick finally decided to carry out his plan. He went to the nearest store and bought a fairly strong rope, and at the same time a flashlight. In the evening, when it was getting dark but the birds were still ringing, Nick tied himself tighter at the waist, tied the other end on a roller, and holding the flashlight in his hand began to descend, millimeter by millimeter, moving his feet along the smooth interior of the well. When he reached about 30 meters, he switched on his flashlight and began using it to fumble around the walls and look down. He was sure he wouldn't fall, though, because he knew exactly the depth of his well. He measured it himself. His feet felt the crunching boards that had been laid at the bottom of the well. He shone his flashlight and suddenly discovered an inscription, unevenly carved on a gray wall, which he was sure was not there when this well was laid. The inscription read, "The Sorcerer Nalo was publicly executed at this place in 1242. May this place be cursed by God and the devil from now on." Nick scratched his head. It's weird. Was this stone in the masonry? Suddenly, the boards instantly turned red, soaked with something emanating from the bowels of the earth. Nick screamed and, straining his arms, climbed up. The blood. And it was nothing more than that was rising behind him, and by the time Nick climbed over the edge of the well and landed on the ground, it had already filled the well to the brim. Nick got to his feet and stared blankly at the bloody water, almost overflowing over the edges. Nick didn't remember how he screamed in horror and ran headlong away from this place and from the revived ancient sorcerer who had risen from the dead. The next morning, an excavator and a team of workers drove up to Nick's yard. Nick was so scared that he didn't skimp and paid as much as he wanted for this. "What's the matter, man?" a worker in a greasy jacket asked unceremoniously, grinding a cigarette, cheerfully looking around. "Are we going to demolish the house?" "What kind of house?" Nick threw up his hands but decided not to swear, or else the workers might spit and leave. "There's the well, don't you see? So it wouldn't hurt to fill it up, you know? And what's so incomprehensible?" The foreman shrugged his shoulders and shouted to the others, "Hey guys, go to work!" The excavator immediately set to work, filling the well with a toothed bucket. In an instant, it was literally leveled to the ground, and Nick said goodbye to the workers. No, he wasn't going to dig where he'd seen such a gruesome skeleton. After all, wouldn't it be better to take care of the plumbing? But who's sure that blood won't flow out of it instead of water? Imagine Nick's surprise when the next morning he found a scroll of paper at the site of the buried well. He picked up the scroll in surprise, which rustled in his fingers, and the edges of the scroll were crumbling, obviously due to the antiquity of this paper. On it, in faded calligraphic letters, was written, "The certificate of execution was laid 1242 A.D. May, publicly burned in the square." The paper caught fire in Nick's hands and turned to ashes before he burned his fingers and dropped it onto the ground, which had not yet had time to stamp into the ground where the ill-fated well had been yesterday. The scroll burned out, and Nick stared in amazement at the ground, from the depths of which came the same inhuman voice that sent chills through his skin. "You trespassed on my execution site, and now you're going to die." Almost simultaneously, the ground beneath Nick's feet burst into flames, and he fell to the ground, screaming, and the fire left a charred wreck in a matter of seconds. A gust of wind blew in the very next instant, scattering the black bones into dust, along with the unfortunate man's life suddenly ending.